Great. A very warm welcome to you, and thank you for joining us here on this session on developing independent learners in the history classroom, slightly provocatively subtitled, as I said, Why I Love Project Week Work. So, independent learners. We all want our students to be independent, don't we? We want them to be people who, when they move on to A-level, to university and out into life, they're young people who can take ownership and control of their learning, that they're people who can set themselves goals, make choices, take responsibility for constructing and carrying out their own learning, and can monitor their own progress towards achieving their learning goals. But it's really difficult to achieve that. It's something I've always struggled with. And my thinking about promoting independent learning has developed quite a lot in the last few years. So in today's session, I'm going to take you through a little journey of how I've tried to do this. And I'm going to start with the story of Ed. Here's Ed. He's a real Year 9 student, though it's not his real name. And he's a low to middle prior retainer and was always in class one of those classic passive learners, somebody who would put his hand up to ask whether he should turn the page in his exercise book. And when we went into lockdown in 2020, he was expected to log on to our school system, to get onto Firefly, to find his asynchronous lessons and to engage in learning. And I'm afraid I wasn't very surprised when after lesson 1 of history, when I went to check if he'd done the work, there was no response. So I called home. I didn't know what to do, he said. So I explained. Lesson 2, we had progress. I got an email from Ed and he said, I can't find what to do today. So I phoned and I explained and he did the work. Lesson 3, his email said, hello, I don't know what to put for the middle row of the table that I'd set as a task. He'd completed the first row and the third row. By lesson 4, Ed was genuinely transformed. Here's his email, lesson 4. Hello, thank you. I love learning about World War I and World War II. I find it interesting and amazing to know what happened. And by lesson 5, I was getting all these emails from him. He'd been reading the extending learning stuff about Stalin and Hitler, and it was really interesting. And he then set himself a project on Stalin and said, I wrote this because I was interested in it, so I wanted to learn more about it and write it down. And that bit I found really powerful. I wanted to learn more about it and write it down. What was it that had helped Ed? I really reflected on this, and I thought there were kind of 3 key things that had helped him become an independent learner. He'd found purpose in his learning. He himself had become intrinsically motivated to find out more and to create powerful project outcomes. He was also supported to succeed by me and by the resources he had, gaining confidence that he could really master the knowledge and learning step by step. But he'd also really embraced autonomy. He'd had some choice of his outcomes. He'd worked at his own pace. He'd assessed his own progress. And I expect you can think of students who responded like this in lockdown as well. But he may have become an independent learner in that context. What I wanted to think about was how could I embed this into my curriculum so that students could become independent learners in the classroom? And what I did was I took those 3 key concepts about motivation for independent learning: purpose, mastery, and autonomy. And I thought about what practical approaches I could introduce or I could build on that would really embed those in the curriculum and help my students become more independent as they travelled through school. And that's what I'm going to explore in the rest of the webinar. So, number 1, purpose. In order for students to become independent, they must have a sense of purpose. There must be a reason for which they're doing something. Going back a few years in 2003, the Assessment Reform Group said, intrinsic motivation for learning is stimulated by tasks of optimal novelty and difficulty relevant to students' personal interests and providing for personal choice and control. Now, that doesn't mean that if students are going to get engaged, all their projects have to be about skateboarding, but the idea that you get their interest, you give them choice and control is so important. And I started trying to develop this in lockdown and when we came back to school by creating in each year of 7, 8, 9 and 10 one big project that students would do where they'd really develop and build their skills as independent learners. Inquiries that had an element of choice and an authentic outcome. That idea of an authentic outcome, it comes from expeditionary learning and the sort of classic project-based approach. And it means that when the students start on their project, they know what their outcome is going to be, and they know they're going to have an authentic audience. They're not just going to be producing words on the page to be mocked by a teacher. So in Year 7, we've now introduced, it's actually Chloe Bateman's fantastic scheme of work, writing historical fiction about medieval life set in a medieval village. And it's a really, really tightly scaffolded project where the students learn in depth kind of to set the context of a medieval village and then bring their own creativity to it. And at the end, we publish all their stories in an online book, which is shared with the community, with families, and they feel a real sense of pride and achievement, as well as learning a huge amount as they do it. By Year 8, they've got a bit more independence and a bit more choice. We study the transatlantic trade and enslaved people in a very kind of rigorous and challenging way in class, with lots of teacher explanation and exploration before they're ready to take on their project. But then they take it deeper, looking at individual projects on either African kingdoms or slave rebellions or the legacies of slavery. And at the end, they have a big exhibition where the students all share their work, parents are invited in, and they feel a huge sense of ownership, and it's so memorable. They talk about the projects they did on slavery for years afterwards. My Year 8s at the moment, who are slightly tricky class, are absolutely loving it. They're completely absorbed when they work in this. And finally, I'll just tell you briefly about our Year 9 project. The summer of Year 9, that summer when some are going on to GCSE and some are giving up history. I give them all quite a bit of freedom in that each child gets to choose one specific thing that they're going to research for the whole of the half term. They're based around what the most significant events and changes of the 20th century are. And they choose a huge range of topics from here, D-Day, LGBTQ+ rights, suffrage, Gandhi, all sorts. Every single student in the class has to do something different. But I don't just send them off to Google. I actually create really, really rich resource pages on Firefly, on our online platform for them. It's a lot of work setting up a really good project, but once it's set up, it takes on a life of its own, and it's really, really easy to run. So they're helped with their research, and we scaffold it as they go through, kind of looking at their event through different historical lenses, using different historical disciplinary concepts. But they really, really love that moment of feeling like they're doing their own research. And at the end, again, we have an exhibition and a balloon debate about what were the most significant events and changes of that time. But some of you might be thinking, what about the knowledge in all this? What about instruction? Because the knowledge-rich curriculum and cognitive science-led theories about how children learn, they're often framed in real sort of opposition to the idea of project-based learning. But I don't think in any way that the two are mutually incompatible. In fact, I think that one really informs the other. That if you're going to do really truly effective direct instruction, then you need your students to be actively engaged with the learning. And that instruction itself is a key component in developing independent learners. So my second conceptual theory is the absolute crucial idea that students, in order to be independent, must have mastery of the knowledge and skills of the topic that they're studying. I wouldn't want anyone to think that I was promoting doing the sort of projects where you just send children away to find stuff out in a completely unscaffolded way. I think it's really important that you use a very specific approach to task design so that students, by the time they're becoming independent, they have the knowledge and understanding that's really needed to be successful. I often frame that in the idea of Anne Edwards' 4 quadrants model here, where you start with your sort of teacher-led, setting the context, building the field, you model, you construct jointly, and eventually, not straight away, but eventually you get to that independent construction stage. And I'm demonstrating it just here. This is just a snip from my Year 7 Firefly. Each of these is a lesson in our medieval scheme of work. And you can see actually that the first 6 lessons, they all introduce the key knowledge that's needed. They're all setting the context. So they learn about medieval village life and farming and religion, crime and punishment, before they get onto the stage of scaffolding, modelling, and then being creative and drafting themselves. So to plan and to use really efficient task design for projects, I think it's very important to ensure that you get that knowledge in there before you set students off to be independent. But even once you've done that, it's possible that the students are going to go off and do something that's really quite unconnected. And how do we make sure they take accountability for really using that knowledge and for doing something that is meaningful and powerful and will help them retain and understand what they've learned in an even deeper way? And that's where the third theory comes in, the theory of autonomy, the right or condition of self-government, and the importance of really teaching students those metacognitive tasks of planning, monitoring, and evaluating their own learning, so that we can actually shift the locus of control over to the student, so that they are accountable to themselves for achieving a really, really powerful outcome. And we do this in 2 ways. One is, as we do every project, we always have that explicit focus on metacognitive processes. So we teach them explicitly how to plan, how to think about the ways in which they're learning, and particularly how to self-regulate, how to check on their progression and evaluate their successes. And we do this for every single project we do. Right at the beginning of the whole sort of set of inquiries that are going to lead up to the project, the students get a study guide which specifies the key knowledge that they're going to learn, but it also enables them to track as they go through it what they've learned about and how well they've understood it. So for instance, in Year 10, when they're doing an inquiry that leads into a project on how the Nazis got what they wanted in Northeim, they've got all of these kind of key tactics for control of Germany here. And as we go through, they're keeping track of their notes, of their understanding, of their sort of mastery of the learning. And then eventually they can tick off how far they've included it in their final outcome. And that makes sure that they're accountable and they know how they're doing. There's no surprises at the end. They themselves are having the control over their learning. So I hope very briefly I've succeeded in going through 3 key strategies for independent learning. I've actually popped these onto a handout, which I'll send out when we send out the video. But thinking about purpose, mastery, and autonomy, I'd ask you to think about these questions as you go. And if you'd like to enter into discussion about them on Twitter, that would be fantastic. In terms of purpose, might you think about introducing an authentic outcome to give a scheme of work some real purpose? In terms of mastery, how might you adjust your task design over a series of lessons to help your students become more independent? And in terms of autonomy, can you plan for that self-assessment over a series of lessons to shift the locus of control? Are you convinced? Would you like to try any of those things and see if you end up with students who are genuinely agentic and independent learners? Thank you.
Thank